Hey everybody, this is John, and I know it's been a while. There's been a lot going on, kind of. But I wanted to pop in and talk about what's been in the news recently, but it's also going to be kind of a theory episode. So basically I'm going to talk about Foucault and his critique of the repressive hypothesis, right, in History of Sexuality. And I'm going to use that as an entry point into the analysis of this demand to condemn white supremacy, to condemn the Proud Boys, etc., which Trump just capitulated to. I hope to make this video before that happened, but alas, I was not quick enough. But so Foucault addresses what he calls the repressive hypothesis, right? And that's this idea that with the rise of bourgeois society, we saw an increasing pervasive repression of sexuality, right? So the idea here is like Victorian era prudery, okay? So Foucault thinks that this view is actually almost exactly backwards. For one, he thinks that the sovereign power that functions via negation, restriction, subtraction, deduction, by taking away, by taking life, right, has been replaced as the primary form of power in modernity. Sexuality, he says, becomes in the modern era the target of other strategies of power. It becomes subject to biopower, specifically, which is a kind of combination of disciplinary power and biopolitics. And this biopower, he says, doesn't operate deductively. It works productively. It operates on and through the constitution of human beings as subjects, okay, in our form of subjectivity, the form of human life. So to stay with this Victorian example for a moment, Victorian sexuality, Foucault says that while it is true that some forms of sexuality at this time came under a form of prohibition, right, talking about sexual matters in public, etc., that far from these matters becoming invisible, there was an explosive proliferation of discourse about sexuality. One might think here, for example, of Freud, who's obviously obsessed with sexuality, thinks everything ultimately refers to sex. Sexuality at this time was being medicalized, psychologized, and power was not so much operating by prohibiting certain aspects, right, related to sexuality, as it was operating by compelling us to speak about it, to pay attention to it, to become really activated as sexual subjects, to become subjectivated as sexual subjects. And we were supposed to pay close attention to our thoughts, sexual thoughts and our inclinations, to be vigilant in their observation, because they might hold some kind of secret clue about us, about our health, about our mental health, about our well-being, etc. Morally, medically, psychopathologically. So you were supposed to be honest about it, confess it, right? You're supposed to talk about it just in the right places, the disciplinary institutions, to your therapist, to your doctor, to your teacher. And so as you work consciously to avoid sexual thoughts, to monitor and detect them, to punish yourself for them, to eliminate reminders of sexual objects in your life, fantasies. There's this famous image of like the coffee table with a cover on it, on one of its legs, so that you can avoid being reminded of the the curvature of a woman's body or whatever, and being aroused. But actually this public ban leads to private obsession, right, to fixation. Perversity actually proliferates in this period of time, different forms of sexuality, and sexuality becomes the major theme in all of this discourse. People are cataloging it. You're compelled to pay attention to it, to confess it to the proper authorities, to conform yourself to some idea of healthy sexuality, right? You're supposed to speak about it in the right venues in order to become disciplined. To have your sexuality disciplined, to become a discipline, to learn to manage your sexuality. So the point is that for Foucault, far from being silenced or condemned to oblivion, the point is that actually sovereign power hasn't eliminated sexuality. Biopower has operated by turning it into an object of observation and management. It turns it into a preoccupation. We think about it not less, but in fact vastly more, right? So the prohibition in one arena is combined with a proliferation an obsessionalism about it in another. Right? So, turning to the topic of the day, with that said, there's a new demand for confessions, for denunciations and condemnations, a new suite of thoughts and attitudes and behaviors that are verboten, right? There's a new proliferation of discourse on a particular subject, right? We can think about critical race theory, implicit bias tests, training, the corporate implementation of these things. People like Robin DiAngelo, corporate consultants, making millions of dollars for helping companies to formulate rules like this, to spread awareness, etc. The idea of critical race theory itself says that every white person is racist automatically, right? So they can't get rid of it, much like sexuality. So what must they do? What are they being demanded to do, right? To be attentive, to self-monitor, to confess their racism, to confess their racist thoughts and attitudes, to try to detect and manage your biases, right? Am I being clear? There is a whole major industry built around this stuff. In addition to what I've already mentioned, right, it's the major impetus and theme of the biggest social movement we've seen in a long time. It's been out in the street for months. It's part of every corporate marketing campaign. There's an enormous amount of social pressure being put on people to be attentive to race and racism, to be fixated upon, even to constitute themselves as racial or racially conscious subjects, right? And a whole field of attitudes and behaviors and thoughts and opinions and political positions is currently being codified. There's a nosology of supposed racism being developed for the analysis, for the unpacking of of all of us and our individual minds and our individual lives. And we're supposed to think about the moral universe in these terms, right? And similar, again, to sexuality, this stuff is disciplinary and biopolitical, right? It's biopower. Train yourself, monitor yourself, understand yourself in these moral terms, organize your conduct accordingly. All that on the one hand, and on the other, this is a topic that's biological and demographic in some sense, right? So it's biopolitical and it's disciplinary. And it becomes, as he said with sexuality, essentially a police matter. And he doesn't mean police in terms of cops. He means policing in the sense of the powers, the pressures, the forces that are arrayed in society so as to perpetuate, in some sense, the status quo, to preserve the order as it is, right? We're all being policed. Our thoughts are being policed, our behaviors, etc. And so we're being told to confess, to condemn, to denounce, to engage in these ritual denunciations. And Trump actually just did condemn white supremacy. He's done it a number of times. Unfortunately, he even condemned the Proud Boys specifically this time. But the demand can't and won't ever be fully satisfied. Why? Because we're not dealing here with sovereign power and prohibition, right? We're dealing... The coercive power that is operative today in this sphere doesn't function deductively. It's productive. There's a subjectivating dimension to its operation. It's part of a disciplinary regime. So you can't engage in enough performative disavowals, right? It's not really about the semantics of what you're saying. It's not really about any kind of referent, right, of the disavowal. It's about the performance. It's about subjecting yourself to these forces, accepting this frame, accepting these terms of the debate, assenting to this narrative, to the discursive prolixity on the subject of race and racism and white supremacy. It accepts that these particular figures demanding these denunciations are in fact the proper authorities. They can police us, right? They administer the collective and individual morality. So in this case, when Trump condemns white supremacy, we have to ask, what is happening? Well, he's assuming a subordinate position with respect to, in this case, even the opposing political party. He accepts the narrative animating most of their political discourse, motivating even hostility toward him specifically, right? This is the language spoken in order to combat him, right? He accepts that they are in a position of moral superiority of him, and that they're capable of making these demands. that they can pronounce on his misdeeds, that they are the judges of proper conduct, of his and the rest of societies, of the proper beliefs. He gives this discourse legitimacy, right? He gives this operation of biopower legitimacy. He contributes to the disciplinary regime and its survival and its continuation. He contributes to a regime in which people are tasked with internalizing this policing, right? And being policed. So Foucault would have advised, certainly, Trump not to do it. He would have advised him not to denounce or condemn white supremacy. To instead think about the way this discourse functions, to the way that power is functioning, to the mechanisms of power, right? And perhaps to the consideration of what is the end here? Why is power being organized in this way? So maybe you ask, okay, that's all well and good, John, but what's the point? What would be the point here? What is the point of manufacturing an anti-racist subject, right? So this is more contentious than the other part of what I'm saying, I suppose. But I think there's a pretty obvious explanation here too, right? One that's pretty ready to hand. So for example, my wife the other day, she's in public health, and she was thinking aloud, looking at the most recent research on coronavirus or whatever, and she said, "Wow, it's weird that Black people are so disproportionately affected by everything negative, And then she added, maybe because they're disproportionately poor." And I think this is exactly correct, and it's exactly the point. Our social and political universe is being resignified. It's being recoded. Our political discourse is being subject to an operation whereby these biological or even biopolitical categories are systematically replacing the class categories. So instead of the poor are disproportionately affected by COVID, we get Black people are disproportionately affected by COVID, right? And this is just across the board. And there's a clear beneficiary of this operation everywhere in our discourse, right? And of course, it so happens that this beneficiary is precisely the people who hold the levels of power in society. When Goldman Sachs commits to making some percentage of their board Black, some percentage of it female, whatever, they can retain possession by a particular class 100%. When these elite universities commit to some kind of racial quota, right? Again, this is simultaneously a rejection of class-based analyses and class-based politics. When the losers of globalization can just be called closed-minded bigots or whatever, white supremacists, instead of being called the poor or the working class, right? Then global capital becomes invulnerable to attack, specifically of a moral kind of attack. So these discourses allow for the working class to be reconceptualized, resignified. There used to be this idea, for example, in capitalist countries, there was this critique, right, that said that the ideological apparatus in capitalist countries rendered poverty as a moral failing. Like, you could pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, but you're lazy, so you're bad. You're poor, it's because you suck. You're bad, right? And the idea is this kind of discourse legitimated the rich. Today I see something. Today we see the same operation, right? Except instead of the moral failing being laziness, contrary to the Protestant work ethic, which presumably has now obsolesced. Instead of that, we get racism. You're not lazy, you're a racist. But it again allows you and your demands to be dismissed. You're a moral leper, right? So that's my view of the purpose, you might say, of what this discourse legitimates, why power is functioning in this way. But in any case, I think that it's not ambiguous, it's not up for debate that power is functioning in this way. And it's important to understand that that's how power is functioning. It's important to understand that's what's going on. It's important for people to not cave, to not confess, to not give in to these mechanisms of power or whatever in this case, to reject the operation of biopower, not to denounce the Proud Boys and white supremacy or whatever, and to think about what the purpose of it all is, right? But so that's my analysis. I hope that was pretty interesting. Tells you a little bit about Foucault and stuff too, and it's topical. So I'm just checking in. Hopefully I'll talk again soon. Remember, don't simply react, but think culture.